It was a night that seemed ripped from an old black-and-white photograph. Cold air, a distant hum of cicadas, the glow of a bonfire cutting pits of amber out of the dark. Men moved in a circle, shoulders brushing, hands on the next man's back, heads bowed. A hooded Klansman in green stepped forward, carrying a long sword. There was a cloth across the eyes of each new member. They could not see the faces around them. They could only feel the weight of the ritual and hear the words that bound them, an oath sworn to the welfare of a race. One of the men there was not who he appeared to be. He was an FBI agent, blindfolded, feeling the shoulders of men he would later betray, listening to an old terror rebrand itself in modern language. The agent was Scott Payne. Tall, heavily tattooed, a man who could pass anywhere among bikers and street racists because he looked like what they wanted to trust. He had the voice, the gait, the scars. That outward fit, his physical presence, his past leanings, his readiness to play the part, became his credential in more than one undercover world. But credentials were a dangerous currency. The very things that made him believable were the things that weighed on him, the threads that could pull him under. It was dark. I couldn't see a damn thing, Scott would later say. I could only feel the people around me. I knew some of them would hurt others if allowed to keep going. The words were short. They carried the numb shock of someone who had been there and who still counted the cost. How does a federal agent end up with a sword in his hand, reciting the language of a hate group? How far can someone go pretending to belong before they are swallowed by the performance? Those questions sat at the heart of Scott Payne's work, and at the center of a broader, more urgent story about the way violence adapts and organizes in the United States. The ceremony in that Alabama field is the opening image, but it is not the whole story. It is the hinge between a career spent learning how to be trusted inside violent circles and a country confronting a new breed of organized hate. If you want more deep investigations like this, hit subscribe. Scott was not the archetypal suit with a badge, no neat hair and tie. He had grown up in environments where a rough edge and a certain toughness were a social currency. He'd flirted with dark ideas in his youth, flirtations that left him acquainted with the language and attitudes he'd later need to feign. He knew how to laugh at the same dirty jokes, how to let anger flare just enough to be believable, how to move in a barroom bruiser rhythm so he would not stand out. That background made him useful to the Bureau, and useful in the most uncomfortable way. He could enter a room and be seen as one of them. Quantico taught him to turn that usefulness into a tool. The academy and then specialized undercover school were where the theatrical elements of deception met a strict clinical purpose. Undercover work is not acting for applause. It is painstaking, heavily supervised role-playing designed to build a legend, the fabricated life story that converts suspicion into trust. Scott trained in how to maintain a cover identity under pressure, how to answer questions that might probe at the seams of fabrication, and how to make friendships that genuinely felt like friendships while the truth was kept secret. This training was as much psychological as practical. The academy exposed recruits to sleep deprivation, role reversals, and scenarios that tested where they'd draw the line. You have to be believable, he told investigators later. You have to smell like the life you're pretending to live. The line was blunt, but it cut to the point. Authenticity is the agent's currency. If the agent loses that authenticity, the operation is lost. If the agent keeps it too well, he risks losing himself. Before the Klan, before the camps, there were motorcycles. Scott's first deep field work came inside outlaw motorcycle gangs, most notably the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Working among bikers was in many ways a training ground. The outlaws had their own codes, rituals, a tight territorial sense of loyalty that could be hard to earn and lethal to fake. To be accepted, Scott had to earn scars that were social rather than physical. He needed to be at the right bar at the right time, make the right crude joke, drink until he wasn't acting anymore. He had to be prepared to back up his words with willingness to be present when violence or theft occurred. That willingness, carefully contained by handlers and legal boundaries, allowed him to build a network of relationships. Inside the Outlaws, he made a friend named Town, Scott Town, as he was called by the club. Town was a real connection. Laughter over bad coffee, the kind of inside jokes that become the glue of masculine subcultures, the shared contempt for outsiders. They fought together in a barroom brawl once, a staged scuffle designed to prove loyalty. Later, Town would be arrested in connection with the same cases that the club's leadership faced. The paradox of friendship and betrayal lurked in every close moment. "You don't get to pick your friends inside these clubs," Scott explained. "You pick people who'll watch your back. Then you realize you're working to put them behind bars. That's the hardest part." Those arrests came after a sustained investigation codenamed Operation Roadkill. The operation was not a single explosive sting. It was the slow accumulation of evidence, controlled buys, observations, recordings, layered until prosecutors had a case. The methods used were standard investigative tools, the kind that civilians see in movies: undercover purchases at staged handoffs, carefully documented meetings, and coordination with local law enforcement and SWAT for arrests. Scott's role was to move among the outlaws long enough to see the patterns, where the drugs were moved, who coordinated shipments, how money flowed. The arrests were large, and they reverberated with sentences that carried weight. Several members received long prison terms. Some faces from the club disappeared from the street forever. To those victims of crime and to public safety, the result was a victory. But for Scott, the victory carried a price. He had learned a painful truth. Being the person people trusted made the betrayal sharper. Those bonds had become real in small human moments. Fist bumps after a ride, an extra beer on a cold night. The faster his legend grew in criminal circles, the more he felt the moral pull. "You can't let people know what you're doing," he said. "You can't let them see that you are pretending. But you also can't let the lies eat you." Operation Roadkill established him as a credible undercover operator. It gave him the street cred that allowed handlers to place him into larger, more complex environments. It also taught him about escalation. The outlaws operated with a certain code. Violence existed, but was often transactional. What came next? The kinds of groups that fused ideology, ritual, and the promise of a larger upheaval moved beyond the street-level criminality of motorcycle gangs. The threat was different. It was ideological. It wanted to change the world. The Klan was, for many, a relic. Its era of large cross-burnings and mass membership had faded from the headlines. Yet in pockets across the country, cells remained, older men clinging to ritual and younger men seeking a vocabulary of hate. The group Scott infiltrated was not a sprawling national headquarters. It was a local Klan that met in rural spaces where secrecy was easier and scrutiny was lighter. The men there called themselves a family. They had handshakes, robes, a naturalization ritual intended to cement belonging. The ceremony was designed to feel momentous. That deliberateness, the way a sword was presented, the way the blindfold blocked sight to emphasize submission, was part of what made the ritual a powerful tool of recruitment and loyalty. Scott's entry into the Klan was, in facade, almost banal. A call to a hotline, a claimed identity as a traveling musician, a set of small, believable lies. Those lies were the foundation of millions of such entries. They are as much craft as deception. What followed was an immersion that exposed him to something older and more ritualized than the outlaw biker scene. The robes, the insignia, the chants, these were not mere props. They were symbolic acts that bound men to an idea of self in relation to others. The oath he heard, the line about fostering the welfare of a race, was explicit in its exclusion and in its call for action. When extremist rhetoric is performed in a circle, in a ritual, it stops being abstract. It becomes a shared commitment. The ritual left Scott physically lightheaded. He described the sensation of being hooded and not knowing what was beyond the circle. "You're relying on touch and sound," he said. "Your other senses sharpen because sight is taken away. You start to feel people breathe." The ceremony had a tactical purpose. It deepened the bond among initiates, and it drowned out the outside world until the idea of belonging overrode old hesitations. Yet even as he played the role, Scott was cautious. The Bureau's rules were clear. Undercover work must avoid entrapment, must avoid facilitating crimes beyond what the law allows. The legal and ethical tightrope is narrow. An agent cannot incite violence or create crimes where none existed, but he must observe, document, and, when required, prevent imminent harm. The Klan's gatherings were alarming. They were small, but small cells can be radical and deadly in the right context. Scott saw the ritual as one tile in a larger mosaic. nostalgic, poisonous, and potentially dangerous when combined with modern tools of radicalization. The clan's members were varied. Some were older veterans of a now-diminished overt movement. Others were younger men, more online than off, who sought the power of belonging. One of the men Scott encountered carried the nickname Jack Daniels, a man who had a charisma that made younger members follow him. There were also names like Clue and clusters of affiliations that connected small-town racism to a broader network. They spoke in archaic phrases and modern code words. They joked about some things and spoke deadly seriously about others. Scott would later describe a robe fitting, the absurdity of trying on ritual garb in a cold church basement, the way fabric fell differently on different men, the furtive laughter that breaks the tension of such strange rites. Those small moments, the ordinary human friction under the extraordinary umbrella of hateful ideology, made the work heavy. It exposed how a ritual could be both ridiculous and deeply binding at once. The performance made recruits commit not only with rhetoric but with a public demonstration of submission. But ritual alone did not constitute the greatest danger. Across the same stretch of years, a new breed of extremist emerged, accelerationist groups that saw violence not simply as an endpoint, but as a catalyst. These movements argued that societal collapse was both inevitable and desirable, and they sought to hasten it. Their language was different. Terms like siege and accelerationism signaled an embrace of ideology over tradition. The Bugaloo, a meme-turned movement, repackaged apocalyptic fantasies into a call for armed rebellion. What made these movements particularly troubling was their hybrid nature. They were born online, nurtured in forums, and then brought into the real world by travel, training camps, and targeted plots. Through his work with the Outlaws and the Klan, Scott became increasingly aware that the threat to public safety had shifted. The Outlaws committed crimes for profit and codes of territory. The Klan sought cultural dominance through intimidation. Accelerationists wanted chaos. And the online world provided a funnel. Discord servers, encrypted chats, and image boards converted frustration into a recruitment pipeline. He witnessed how easy it was for someone to travel from trolling to plotting in a matter of months. Scott would come to see that the Klan's rituals and the motorcycle gang's codes, while different, could be complementary in dangerous hybrids. People moved between scenes. Veterans of biker clubs could become moonlighting members of a local clan. A young recruit, initially drawn to edgy internet talk, could seek out a real-world unit for training. The porous boundaries among groups made the domestic extremist landscape more volatile. As the months in the field stretched on, Scott's double life began to impose itself on his body and mind. He learned to mimic laughter and to stifle moral revulsion. He ate with men whose language would later be entered into evidence. He let cigarettes smoke linger on his clothes when he did not want handlers to notice a change. He drank at times when sobriety would have been safer. Undercover life creates tiny lies piled upon larger ones, and the human brain is adept at normalizing. Scott found himself dreaming in the voices of the men he infiltrated. He had to remind himself regularly of why the work mattered, to keep a clear line between identification and sympathy. There were close calls. Once, in a bar that smelled of spilled beer and old sweat, someone took Scott's credibility too seriously. A conversation reached a heat that no tape recorder could cool. Scott felt the tug of instinct and training. Keep calm. Let the situation play out. Don't expose the cover by panicking. He remembered the taste of bile and the sound of fists hitting wood. In those moments, the split between the man playing a role and the man who held a federal badge felt razor thin. "You learn to breathe slow and make a joke," he said later, voice tight. "Even when your palms are sweating, you smile." Operation Roadkill and the Klan operation were contemporaneous in the sense that one fed the credibility of the other. The Outlaws' arrests gave Scott the kind of street creds a Klan might admire. Familiarity with violence, apparent disdain for law enforcement, and the aura of a man who had earned his stripes. That reputation opened doors that would otherwise stay closed. Trust travels by reputation in closed communities. A single recommendation can be worth more than weeks of conversation. But trust also breeds expectations. To be accepted into the Klan's inner circles, Scott had to take visible steps beyond mere attendance. He had to be present at meetings and at rituals. He had to let himself be seen taking stands the group expected. That included associating with known extremists and participating in the mundane logistics that a cell required, driving people to meetings, sharing rides, and forming the sort of small human kinship that makes a conspiracy feel like a family. Each act of normalcy knitted the fabric of belief tighter. Ritual night at the Alabama field formed a mental marker for Scott. He felt the sword, he heard the oath, and he tasted the rallying phoniness of a faux brotherhood. After the ceremony, as the robes were folded and the men dispersed into the cold, Scott walked away with more than a file in a case binder. He carried the silent knowledge of who the members were, what they said they wanted, and the capacity for violence that lay, like tinder, waiting for a spark. The spark arrived in a way that was both vintage and modern. An older member's talk of taking back streets gave way, in private conversations and online threads, to talk of action. The rhetoric of the Klan's older generation, intimidation through public ritual, was being translated by younger, internet-savvy members into plans that might be executed with modern logistics. Where the Klan once boasted of numbers and public presence, a new cadre preferred targeted attacks inspired by the ideological prescriptions of accelerationist texts. They spoke of learning techniques from forums and of tests to separate the talkers from the doers. In those conversations, Scott heard the contours of plots, targets discussed with an alarming clinicality, timelines hinted at in passing. He saw how the rhetoric that had been ritualized in the field could morph into operational calls for violence. Scott's case team watched this progression closely. The Bureau's approach to domestic extremist groups tends to be patient and evidence-driven. It is not enough to be offended. There must be a crime to charge. Yet imminence matters. When statements move beyond murmurings and into stepping stones toward action, casing houses, copies of manifestos, lists of potential victims, handlers must weigh the need to arrest against the need to collect sufficient evidence for convictions. The legal tightrope factors as a moral one in Scott's mind. Prevent harm without creating it. Document enough to put people away without making crimes that didn't exist. He could see the calculus in the faces around him during briefings. Men and women tired from long operations, eyes hollow where sleep had been taken by watch schedules. It was in the dawn hours of a Monday that Scott realized the Klan cell he had infiltrated was not simply nostalgic. It had affiliates with modern, lethal ambitions. Portions of private chat logs and encrypted threads, some connections Scott had cultivated by following the men into online spaces, revealed mentions of other groups, other forums, and the suggestion of training camps. Words like camp and test appeared alongside references to a reading list that included explicit accelerationist texts. Scott's stomach lurched. He had intended to gather intelligence on a local cell. He now had threads that connected local men to a broader network that wanted to escalate. He took the information up the chain. The case team convened in a windowless room full of whiteboards and coffee cups cooling in styrofoam. The discussions were deliberative, sometimes heated. Some argued for quick action to disrupt what appeared to be a budding conspiracy. Others insisted that the evidence needed to meet prosecutorial standards. In those debates, Scott's role was to provide context. What he had seen in the field, the tone of the men's speech, the logistics they had discussed. He had to explain what it felt like to be in the ritual, what a robe-fitting meant in terms of commitment, and how a seemingly harmless hotline call could open a door to violent planning. Outside the conference rooms, doctrine and policy sat against human consequences. Scott worried about the men he had befriended. He worried about himself. He worried about victims who could be targeted. Every undercover operation yields collateral damage. Relationships severed, trust violated, lives upended. The legal outcomes could not restore what had been broken. "There's no way to be in that circle and not have it change you," he said. "You go in to stop harm, but you also end up causing pain in the lives of people you came to know." And yet the intelligence was clear enough to demand action. The possibility that the Klan cell would coordinate with other extremist groups or that younger members might be funneled into accelerationist camps raised the stakes. The case team set to work expanding the network of investigation, seeking court-authorized surveillance, and crucially, asking Scott to deepen his cover. He understood what that request meant. More time in the field, more nights where the line between performance and identity blurred, more friendships that might have to be the instruments of prosecution. As Scott prepared to re-enter the field, a new thread of information arrived from a different corner of the landscape. chatter about an entity that called itself the Base. The name circulated in the same forums that had been hosting clan sympathizers, private servers with encrypted rooms, channels that spoke of training, of reconnaissance, of find and target operations. The Base combined the modern hallmarks of accelerationist groups, violent philosophy, recruitment funnels, and training camps, with a willingness to translate online talk into in-person action. It was more organized than the clan cells Scott had seen. It had leaders who used monikers like TMBB, Pestilence, and Helter Skelter, handles that meant little on the surface but carried organizational weight inside. The group's online founder, a man known online as Roman Wolf or Ronaldo Nazzaro in certain channels, had cultivated a following that believed in violent disruption as a tactic. Scott had infiltrated violent groups before. He knew the pattern. An online quarrel blossomed into an in-person meeting. An in-person meeting turned into a weekend of training in the woods. A weekend of training birthed plots that, if not intercepted, could end in murder. The Base's rhetoric was different in tone and lethal in intent. Where the clan lent itself to ritual and nostalgia and the outlaws to territorial crime, this new group trafficked in ideological acceleration. It celebrated acts designed to destabilize. It read and circulated dangerous texts that argued for stirring up chaos to create a new order. The scale and ambition of the Base posed a problem. It did not always wear a clear uniform. Members used memes and coded language to vet newcomers. They used private groups and invitation-only chats to cultivate commitment. They promised a path from online grievance to on-the-ground action. That promise proved infectious. For some, it was fantasy. For others, it became practical recruitment into training camps where violent plans were discussed in the plainest of terms. Scott watched the connections form. Men who had once been content with small-town clan meetings now spoke about operations and tests in the Base channels. The clan's rituals had a performative power that made recruits feel bonded. The Base's training camps added practical preparation to that sense of belonging. Scott and his case team began to see the outlines of something far more dangerous than the separate entities they'd been chasing. The threat was shifting from isolated cells to a decentralized network that learned quickly and adapted. As Scott contemplated re-entering more dangerous ground, he thought of Joe Pistone, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and grave respect within the Bureau. Pistone, the legendary undercover agent who had infiltrated the Mafia years earlier, represented what long-term undercover operations could achieve and what they cost in human terms. Pistone's work saved lives and put powerful criminals behind bars. It also left scars on those who performed it. Scott drew both inspiration and caution from that legacy. He knew that patience stitched with resolve, could dismantle dangerous networks. He also knew that each extra day in the field compounded the ethical strain. One late evening, on a porch smelling of chain-link grease and diesel, Scott sat with Town and other outlaws, trading a cigarette passed among men who trusted each other. Town laughed about a road trip they'd planned. Scott felt the familiar tug of belonging and the sharper tug of the file in his pocket, evidence that would help put some of these men in prison. He sipped cheap beer and thought about the men he had prayed to put away, and the men he had come to call friends, and how those two truths could exist within the same breath. A new assignment would demand more of him, deeper cover in online spaces to catch the Base's recruiters, and boots-on-the-ground infiltration of a world where those recruiters met and trained. It was a dangerous pivot. The clan operation had been slow to grow but real. The Base threatened to accelerate violence into action. As Scott readied to fold his body back into an alias, he took stock of what he carried home each night. The physical exhaustion, the intermittent panic that arrived without warning, a chest tightening like someone sitting on it, the nights when he woke drenched in sweat and the lines between role and self blurred. He had experienced moments that could be called panic attacks, sudden breathing difficulty, trembling, an overwhelming sense that the performance had become permanent. He had learned to name those experiences without shame. "You can't do this work without it getting under your skin," he told an investigator. "You can't feel what they feel and not be changed." The clan had shown him ritual's power to bind. The outlaws had shown him how criminal networks trade in loyalty for profit. The Base was beginning to show him how modern extremism fused the two into a deliberate program of violent escalation. The horizon darkened with each new thread he pulled. The challenge for him and for the Bureau was not simply to document wrongdoing, but to prevent imminent harm without tipping the balance into unlawful provocation. It was a late autumn day, leaves browned and falling, when the team decided to widen the net. The clan cell had revealed connections beyond its own ranks. Online chatter suggested camps. Online camps hinted at training. Scott was to split his attention. Maintain contact with the clansmen while infiltrating the base's vetting circles. The risk multiplier was clear. Divide attention, and the chance of a misstep increases. But the potential payoff was heavier arrests and the stoppage of what could be dangerous plots. When he entered his next clan meeting, robes folded neatly in the back of his car just in case, he felt the weight of contradiction more keenly than ever. Around him, the men joked about guns and taking care of business. They spoke with a tongue that had been honed in echo chambers, now sharpened with the kind of vocabulary that made officers think of planning. Scott listened. He smiled in the right places. He kept his eyes attentive to faces he might later have to describe in court. He collected small slips of information, minutes at a time, like someone collecting tiny bones to make a larger skeleton. That skeleton was beginning to show signs of a national organism under construction. The base's spokesman, figures like TMBB, Pestilence, and Helter Skelter, were more than memes. They were nodes. They coordinated camps where recruits learned to survive outdoors, handle weapons, and conceive of political violence as a legitimate instrument. They burned flags and Bibles in ceremonies at some camps, extreme gestures meant to sever recruits from the moral anchors of community. At one camp Scott later learned about, reports indicated the theft and sacrificial killing of a goat, a grotesque ritual that was found to be part ceremonial and part a violent test of commitment. The story, when conveyed by handlers, was restrained. The act was noted as evidence of depravity and possible criminal conduct, not sensational entertainment. Scott's presence within these ecosystems gave the team a vantage few could claim. He could speak the slang, click into a joke, and follow a thread from a Discord channel to a physical campsite. But the cost of that vantage was heavy. Nights at home with family became shorter, tangled with lies about late classes or training at headquarters. The emotional labor of hiding the truth from loved ones compounded the daily professional strain. He was playing a part that demanded entire weekends, months, and sometimes years, and he knew from bitter experience that the day could come when a smile shared over cheap beer would be entered into evidence against the men smiling back. The clan's naturalization ceremony lived in his memory like a photograph he could not shake. He would revisit it, mentally, in moments when the work felt too personal. He would imagine the cloth over his eyes and remember the feel of the sword. He used that image as proof of both his proximity to danger and his responsibility to intervene. That night in Alabama had been a crossroads, a ritual that would have been, in isolation, a disturbing relic. In context, a step toward networks that could converge on real-world violence. As Scott prepared to expand his work into the online corridors that birthed groups like the base, he thought again about the moral geometry of undercover work. To betray those who trusted you is to wound yourself in return, yet failure to betray them, when they are plotting violence, can mean failure to protect innocent lives. The ledger is always split. He kept the division in his pocket like a small, sharp coin to remind himself of the stakes. In the days that followed, the investigation reached a new pitch. Online rooms flagged new messages, a group photo at a hunting camp appeared, an offhand reference in a private chat, an address mentioned only in passing, set off a chain of inquiries. Scott moved between his roles with tight focus. He collected pieces that, if stitched together, would reveal a pattern. The pattern he feared suggested not merely talk, but preparation. He had taken the oath of another sort, the oath of a federal agent to protect the public. That oath required him now to step deeper into worlds of ritual and rant, to risk both exposure and psychological harm, to gather evidence that might save lives. The blindfold of the clan ceremony had been literal. Now there was a different kind of blindfold, the deliberate refusal to let the humanity of those he deceived overwhelm his judgment. He had to see the patterns even when everyone around him wanted only to see a brother. A convergence point was forming on the digital horizon, a call for a weekend meeting where recruits from various cells would gather under the pretense of survival training. The invitations were coded, the logistics oblique, but the intent behind them was clear enough to trained eyes. This was the moment the team had feared, another ritual, but now with practical training attached. Scott's handlers debated the risk, allow him to attend and gather intelligence or intervene early to prevent possible violent training. The decision would not be made lightly. As Scott sat in his car outside a late-night convenience store, the hum of cold air conditioning inside, he thought about the first time he'd been a teenager and heard the call of belonging. He thought about the men he had laughed with in bars, the easy jokes, the fist bumps. He thought about the faces in the clan circle and the weight of the sword. He thought about the files on his desk and the victims who had no voice. He felt the old grinding loneliness that follows someone who must live inside a double life. He knew what the next weeks would ask of him. More patience, more lying, more nights away from home. He also knew the stakes. Allow trained recruits to gather, and the next move could well be an attack. Cut them off too early, and the case might not stand in court. That tension is the legal and moral core of undercover work. Timing is everything. The investigation was moving into a new phase. Scott would be asked to return to the field, not as a biker this time, and not merely as a robes-wearing Klansman, but as someone who could navigate the hybrid space where online recruitment met real-world training. The Klan had given him an entree to ritual violence. The outlaws had taught him the language of criminal loyalty. Now, to protect the public, he would have to learn the ways in which modern extremists transform rhetoric into operation. The lines were moving. The work, as always, would demand more than courage. It would demand a willingness to carry the weight of betrayal and the humility to accept the scars it left behind. That night, before he folded himself into another alias, Scott looked at a photograph he'd taken earlier. A group shot of men at a campsite, faces half hidden by hats, a small bonfire burning behind them. It could have been an innocent outdoor party. It could have been something darker. Somewhere between the two was the truth he had to find. He turned off the light and let the darkness be the kind that hides plans from the unwary and reveals them to the vigilant. He turned off the light and let the darkness be the kind that hides plans from the unwary and reveals them to the vigilant. The coded invitation arrived in a private chat, a casual line about a weekend run in the sticks, with an attached time and a meeting point. It was the kind of throwaway phrase that could mean nothing or everything. Scott read it twice and felt the old professional itch. This was how something began. A casual meet-up, a test of resolve, a weekend that could turn into training. He showed the message to his handler, and they mapped the risk. The decision, as always, came down to the same ledger. Intelligence could save lives, but staying inside put him at risk of being seen and, worse, of being pushed into complicity by circumstances he did not control. He went in as himself, well, as the version of himself that had been polished and reinforced over years. Online, his avatar was vetted and accepted. In the real world, he arrived wearing the clothes that signaled belonging, worn boots, an easy swagger, visible tattoos that read as authenticity to those who looked for it. He walked into a clearing as much of the wood as of the culture, men already there, firelight sparking in their faces, backpacks leaned against trees, and a nervous, anticipatory energy that made him think of every other initiation he'd seen. This was not a hoax. It felt like training. The camp's surface texture was familiar. Whispered commands about silence, discussions of navigation, and exercises in endurance dressed as outdoor survival skill building. But beneath that skin, the conversations moved quickly to darker subjects. Members spoke of targets, people and places that some argued were symbolic, others claimed were tactical. In private, new recruits were asked to prove themselves in ways that ranged from theft to explicit threats. People who had once only posted violent fantasies online were now moving them into practice. Scott listened. He took mental notes. He collected the soundscape of intent. At one camp, a photograph captured a small bonfire and men standing shoulder to shoulder. Flags burned, and beside the flames lay tattered remnants of publications the group despised. Scott later described the scene as both performative and serious. It was symbolic, but the symbolism primed them. It loosened their moral anchors. The images were evidence of a social bond forming around violent fantasy. That bond could be the scaffold for action. Reports came in that animals had been stolen to test recruits' dedication. At one site, a goat had been taken from a farm and killed in a ritualistic act that combined bravado and depravity. The handlers abstained from needless sensationalism when relaying that information. They framed it clinically: property crimes and potential animal cruelty that indicated a group's willingness to break laws to prove commitment. Scott filed those details with a cold hand. The human reactions were harder. He thought about the farm family, the violated space, the way small communities are traumatized by gestures intended to show dominance. He thought about the men who handled the goat as if it were a step on some dark ladder. As Scott moved deeper into the base's vetting channels, he encountered the structure of modern radicalization. Recruitment began with jokes and memes, a shared sense of grievance that morphed into ideological catechisms. Handles like TMBB, Pestilence, Helter Skelter, and Zumnat were more than nicknames. They were roles within the group's ecosystem: recruiter, trainer, logistical planner, recruiter turned commander. Roman Wolf, Ronaldo Nazaro in some threads, operated as a charismatic online figure whose rhetoric translated to followers who wanted boots-on-the-ground action. The language of accelerationism, the idea that collapse should be hastened through violence, was taught not as abstract theory but as tactical guidance on how to recruit, test, and prepare. Scott's presence in the field created bridges the team could not build from headquarters. He could move from private chat to tent circle and back into encrypted rooms where recruits discussed tests and ops. He watched as a young man, bright-eyed in a way that doubled for enthusiasm and naivete, hauled a cooler and declared himself ready. Older members assessed him with a mix of scorn and curiosity. The tests ranged from survival scenarios to breaking minor laws as proof of commitment. The aim was to desensitize, to create an us versus them mentality where the group's internal rules outweighed common law. That was accelerationism's mechanism in motion: ritual, training, escalation. Two threads stood out and tightened like a noose. One was a small cell's discussion of a couple of leftist organizers who lived in a nearby town, an Antifa-affiliated pair who had been vocal at local rallies. The other was talk of shutting down a pro-gun rally scheduled for a nearby city, a public event packed with potential targets. The chatter moved from abstract to practical in subtle ways, casing comments, references to standard routes into the city, and, most significant, language that suggested someone had been tasked to do reconnaissance. None of the messages spelled out a plan in detail. That was not required. The pattern itself raised the flag of imminence for the case team. Scott relayed the details. His case team read the chats and assembled their response. The legal calculus narrowed to a precise demand: intervene when the evidence met the threshold of an imminent threat. They needed to know where and when an operational step would be taken, when casing would become an attack. Meanwhile, Scott's role shifted again. He had to be present at locations where plans were discussed, and he had to do so without giving the impression of fear or wavering commitment. Tension rose to a fever pitch one night when the chat referenced a case-by-case assignment to test a target the week before the rally. The word test in those contexts could mean reconnaissance, watching the routine of a couple, checking who came in and out of a house, seeing how intently they guarded a property. Scott's stomach nodded. The team moved into urgent planning: how to insert protective measures for the potential victims without revealing investigative intent beyond what was defensible, how to ensure that Scott did not get exposed, and how to prepare for a swift arrest if the group moved to act. In the field, Scott noticed a new nervousness in the recruits. They were no longer content to rehearse minor criminality as a demonstration of devotion. They spoke now of operations with lethal imagination. These were not idle online taunts. They were conversations seasoned with lethal seriousness. Scott kept listening, then he did something he hated. He put aside the crude camaraderie to be an observer who would later become the reason some men went to prison. The night the team decided the risk of waiting outweighed the need for more evidence, Scott and his handler prepared for a different kind of pressure: the risk of being the eye in a storm. The plan was not a cinematic raid. It was a coordinated approach that would prevent violence and secure convictions. Scott would be in place at a predetermined node, a staging area the group intended to use en route to the rally. He would be there to signal the moment that justified arrest. The case team had arranged for tactical elements to be nearby, and prosecutors had approved arrest affidavits based on the pattern of communications, the camp observations, and Scott's eyewitness accounts. Moments like these asked more of an undercover agent than stealth. They demanded moral steel. "You watch men you have laughed with get cuffed," Scott said later. "You hold your breath as another life flips from the ordinary to something very different. You have to remind yourself why you were there. He kept that reminder close as the night closed around the staging area. They moved the way the Bureau always moves when lives are at stake, quietly, deliberately, with a kind of deadly patience. Scott signaled. Tactical teams converged. Men were detained. Some did not resist. Some were surprised, disbelief raw on their faces. The arrests were the culmination of months of work, stitching together online recruitment, in-person tests, and the escalation of prepared intent. Courts would later call it an example of modern domestic extremism, morphing from fantasy to procedural planning. The legal outcomes were substantial. Several members of the base cell were indicted on charges that included conspiracy to commit violent acts, firearm offenses, and other federal counts. Convictions followed after careful prosecutions that used both digital records and Scott's in-person testimony to tell the story. Members of the Klan cell faced state and federal charges related to intimidation and conspiracy that, when combined with other evidence, resulted in significant sentences. Operation Roadkill's convictions against Outlaws members had already established the Bureau's willingness to pursue organized criminal networks. Now, the same sustained investigative patience was being used against accelerationists whose fantasies had become logistical possibilities. The arrests produced relief for potential victims and their communities. The Antifa-affiliated couple who had been discussed in the chats expressed deep gratitude and a long, complicated aftermath of fear and displacement. Scott thought of them often, and he felt, in the strange ledger of his work, that this friction was what justified the betrayals. Lives were safer, people slept easier, but the victory was not clean. Sentences do not reverse time. They do not repair trust broken by friends arrested. They do not undo the psychological erosion an agent sustains through years of performance. In the wake of the takedowns, Scott's team combed through evidence and built cases. Online servers were seized, phones were examined, the bases camps were cataloged as training centers where recruits were taught not merely to survive in the woods, but to weaponize grievance. Prosecutors presented thematic narratives at trial, the progression from meme to recruitment, recruitment to camp, camp to plotting. The jury saw chat logs, campsite photographs, and Scott on the stand, calm, precise, and observant. He gave testimony that contextualized the words in the messages, what terms meant in that group's vocabulary, how rituals normalized violent thinking, how young recruits were groomed into operational thinking. Prosecutors emphasized the need for convictions not as retribution, but as removal of immediate danger. Public reaction was mixed. Some praised the arrests as proof the justice system could adapt to evolving extremist threats. Others, distrustful of government authority, decried the tactics of infiltration no matter the outcome. Scott heard both sides and felt neither solace nor vindication. What he felt most keenly was exhaustion. He had been standing in someone else's life for years. Now the weight of the truth pressed him to recalibrate. The base, it turned out, was not utterly eradicated. Networks had decentralized, splintered, and adapted. Some members fled to other forums, some lay low. The social contagion of accelerationism persisted in other corners of the internet. The rhetorical seeds had been scattered widely. Shutting down one cell did not uproot the ideology that produced it. Scott and his peers knew this. They also knew that stopping imminent attacks mattered more than the long war of ideas. The arrests required debriefs that were inward-facing and brutal. Scott went through long sessions with psychologists and counselors, required by both his handlers and his own need to make sense of the erosion inside him. He described sleeping poorly, waking from fragmented dreams where he could no longer tell where the role ended and the self began. He would hear phrases at odd hours, his subconscious repeating the slurs and slogans he'd pretended to embrace. He developed a ritual of his own. Before every debrief he would write down, on a plain sheet of paper, 3 things he could name as purely his, non-negotiables of identity that were outside the facade. It helped in small ways to anchor him. There were professional repercussions, too. The Bureau recognized the operation publicly after convictions, in a way that both honored those who had worked long hours and signaled the seriousness of the domestic threat. Scott received awards, commendations, and quietly, a citation that read less like praise and more like a ledger entry for services rendered in difficult circumstances. He valued the acknowledgement but remained uncomfortable in public adulation. Undercover work, he had learned, is not a story for the person who did it. It is a story for the people who are safer because of it. The legal proceedings dragged in their way. Defense attorneys argued entrapment in some cases, a strategy that sought to portray government involvement as the cause of criminal action rather than the intervention in an existing trajectory. The courts resisted simplistic frames. Judges leaned on the facts, months of evidence that showed a pattern not of creation, but of escalation. Convictions were achieved where the evidence met the standard. Sentences reflected the severity of the conspiracies, and for victims and communities, the rulings provided a degree of closure. Scott watched men he had once called friends receive verdicts that would shape the rest of their lives. He hid his reaction from most, because public emotion could complicate a life already crowded with complexities. In private, he grieved, not for the crimes they'd plotted, but for the waste of human potential and the way propaganda could take bright, albeit misguided, people and place them on a path of destruction. He thought about town, about men who had laughed with him over cigarettes and cheap beer, and how thin the line had been between kinship and criminality. In time, the strain accumulated into a decision that no one could make for him. He had spent years wearing other lives. The toll was visible in his relationships, in his nervous system, in the shakes that arrived unbidden when a familiar slur read out in a courtroom conjured the atmosphere of a tent circle. He had seen too many faces in cuffs. He had been present for both the righteous removal of dangerous actors and the human cost that comes with the method. His retirement decision was not sudden. It was the product of a slow exhaustion that calcified into certainty. Scott's retirement was marked quietly. There was no parade, only a handful of colleagues, a few speeches, and the hollow applause of a community that knew the work but could never quite inhabit it. He left the bureau with awards and file boxes and the knowledge that his testimony had put dangerous men away. He also left with the awareness that the ideologies he had infiltrated would persist in other forms, migrating to new forums and finding new hunger in a different generation. In the years after, he spoke rarely in public, but when he did, his message was the same. Infiltration works, and it is necessary, but it is costly. "We stop attacks," he would say. "That matters, but the cost is real. The psychological debt doesn't just go away." He advocated for better mental health support for undercover agents, for longer debriefs, and for programs that helped reintegrate those who left the field. He wanted the system to recognize that saving lives required tending to the lives of those who did the saving. Communities impacted by the plots built their own rituals of recovery. Neighborhood meetings, church vigils, and local education initiatives sprang up to counter the narratives extremists had used as entry points. There were programs to help at-risk youth find belonging in healthy ways: sports, mentorship, job training, efforts to build loyalty, not on hate, but on civic purpose. Scott offered what help he could, speaking to small groups, supporting educational outreach, and advising on how to recognize the early signs of radicalization. He thought of these as preventive stitches, small acts that might prevent a young person from hearing one meme and deciding it was an entrance to purpose. The legal system continued to adapt. Prosecutors and judges learned more about how to treat digital evidence. Civil authorities worked to create lines of communication with platforms that hosted extremist rhetoric. None of these solutions were silver bullets, but the combined effort, law enforcement, community resilience, and public education, made the space in which these movements grew somewhat narrower. Years after the Alabama night, Scott returned to a field with a different kind of purpose. He did not seek the rush of a blindfolded ceremony. He sought instead a life with a clearer boundary between public and private. He found small satisfactions: repairing fences, reading to a neighbor's child, and walking without scanning the horizon for signals of danger. There were days when images of robes and bonfires crept back into his sleep. There were nights when he would close his eyes and hear the murmur of men around a tent. Yet there were also days when he could be present in a conversation without wearing a persona like armor. He kept a photograph in his glove compartment for a long time, a snapshot of a campsite, the small bonfire, the faces half hidden. It was both a reminder and a warning. He pulled it out once in a while, not to gloat, but to remember why he had made the choices he had. "We did something necessary," he told a friend who asked what he missed most. "But I don't miss being someone I wasn't." The country, for its part, continued to wrestle with the persistence of organized hate. The Klan, diminished as an institution compared to its historical peaks, remained dangerous in fragments. Outlaw motorcycle clubs operated on the margins of legality, sometimes violently. Accelerationist cells, fueled by memes and encrypted chat rooms, presented a new kind of threat whose contours kept changing. Scott's story was one thread in a much larger tapestry of counter-extremism efforts, a case study in how law enforcement can adapt to ideologies that learn and mutate. Public conversations about how to balance civil liberties with security intensified. Legislators, community leaders, and tech companies argued over the best ways to intercept radicalization without trampling on free speech. The debates were necessary and fraught, complicated by the human stories that lay behind every policy decision. Scott watched the debates with a guarded hope that public policy would catch up with the reality his file folders had long described. A few years after his retirement, a small town in his home region declared an unofficial day that some locals called, half-jokingly, Scott Payne Day. It was not an honorific in any formal sense. It was a community's quiet recognition that someone had done dangerous work to keep their streets safer. Scott accepted the gesture with reluctance. He went to the dinner out of a sense of obligation and left with a plate of barbecue and a head full of conflicting emotions. People thanked him for the arrests. Victims' families thanked him for safety. Some of the men he'd once known shook his hand in public with a stoicism that did not betray private memories. The scene was human and complicated, the same texture his career had always had. Even now, the fight against organized hate remains ongoing. New forums host old grievances, new recruits arrive with smartphones and old resentments, new leaders step up where others fall. But the work of infiltration, of placing a human presence inside those spaces, remains a tool in the arsenal against imminent violence. Scott's career illustrated both its necessity and its cost, the quiet heroism of those who risk identity and sanity to prevent carnage, and the moral and psychological consequences that follow. The blindfold in that Alabama field had been removed years ago. The sword had been lowered. The robes had been folded and entered into evidence. Scott had walked away from that night with a history that would not leave him. He had also walked toward something else, a life where he could look at the world without knowing who among him might be plotting violence. That was the real, fragile gift of his work, for others and eventually for himself. He kept returning in his head to the moment the cloth came off. It had been abrupt, a rush of cold air, a blur of faces, and the realization that he had stood shoulder to shoulder with men who thought differently about the value of human life. The memory was a kind of moral map, a point he could revisit when doubts came. "When that cloth came off," he said in one interview, "I felt relief, and the responsibility didn't lift. It transferred." The story of the FBI agent who secretly infiltrated the KKK is not a tale of simple victories. It is the account of a man who lived among dangerous people to prevent them from acting, who watched friends become defendants, and who paid the human cost with parts of himself he did not get back. It is a story that demonstrates both the adaptability of extremist movements and the ways in which dedicated, methodical investigation can interrupt plans before they are carried out. There are no final chapters in this struggle. Extremism adapts, so must the responses to it. But the arrests, the convictions, and the communities that rebuilt after threats were interrupted offer a ledger entry in favor of intervention. Scott's work closed some dangerous doors. It did not and could not solve the larger problem of hate's persistence, that society solves over generations through education, economic opportunity, and community resilience. He still visits now and then. A quiet place where trees whisper and the sound of cicadas in the summer is a backdrop for reflection rather than a prelude to ritual. He walks sometimes with the same measured breath he taught himself in Undercover moments, assiduous, aware, but no longer acting. When he pauses at the memory of that Alabama field, it is not to relish the past or to boast. It is to remember what was necessary and to honor the lives saved because of it. If you want to learn how to recognize signs of radicalization in your community and where to find help, check the resources linked in the description. The work of prevention does not belong to law enforcement alone. It belongs to neighbors, teachers, and families who can offer alternatives to the narratives that groom people toward violence. He had been blindfolded once. The cloth had come off. He had seen what lay in the circle. He had done the work that followed. In the wake of that service, he carried neither simple triumph nor simple regret, only the sober knowledge that vigilance, sacrifice, and community action remain necessary defenses against organized hate.